We're in Revelation chapter 6 this week. Okay, put on your seatbelts. Keep all arms and hands inside the vehicle as we go through this. The time for God's wrath has finally come. Most of the remainder of the book of Revelation will be about God's vengeance as he focuses on the forces of evil and the permanent earth dwellers who don't believe. Now, in the previous chapter, we got to witness a celebration that prepared the throne room for the wrath of God. Now, we don't often think about celebration and God's wrath as coming together, but that's exactly what's happened between last chapter and this chapter. The reason we don't really understand that is because we don't really understand the holiness of God. As I've said before, the word holiness, holy, comes from the Greek word hagios, which means to be separate. In this case, it's separation from evil and separation to the purity of God. We also don't really understand how God sees our sinfulness. We are very forgiving of ourselves most of the time. Some of us recognize how incredibly sinful we are and we mourn over it, and I assume all of us do at some point in time. But God is holy, and he sees our sin as terribly sinful. That's why he sent Christ to the cross, so that he could fellowship with us. Now, we also don't often understand the full extent of what God intends to accomplish. And he will accomplish his plan. In spite of all the resistance from those who are evil and from all of that which is resisting God. But remember, God says in Romans chapter 9, what if, and this is Paul speaking, what if God, wanting to show his wrath and to make his power known, endured with much long suffering the vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, and that he might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy, which he had prepared beforehand for glory, even us whom he called. Let me read that again. What if God, wanting to show his wrath and to make his power known, endured with much long suffering the vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, and that he might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy, which he had prepared beforehand for glory, even us whom he called. So God has been long-suffering with evil. He is now he has come to his limit in this chapter. The time has finally come. The Lambkin has taken the scroll, and he is about to break the seals. And as he breaks each of the seals on this scroll, calamity occurs on the earth. God's judgment is poured out on the earth. These first four are often referred to as the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And remember, apocalypse comes from the word apocalypsis, pretty obvious, which means uncovering or revealing. So these are the four horsemen of the revealing of God's wrath. Then when we see the fifth seal open, we will see beneath the altar the martyrs who have been murdered for their witness, for their testimony of God. Then the sixth seal is open. There's a great earthquake, and fearsome signs appear in the heavens. And we'll talk a little bit about what that might be in a few minutes. But before we get into the seal judgments, I want to talk briefly about the timing of these judgments. As you know, I review the writings of a number of Bible scholars, most of them very conservative, most of them believing in a direct interpretation, a literal interpretation of the scriptures. And even some of them, I think, are a little confused about how things play out in the book of Revelation. They refer to Jesus' description of the end times in Matthew 24. And in that, he says that there are certain things that happen in the middle of the tribulation. And then he says, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. From this, we realize that the second half of the tribulation is referred to as the Great Tribulation. The first half is never referred to that way. But the two halves have to go together. Then in chapter 7, we see a great multitude of people who are coming out of great tribulation. And the word coming out is a present participle, which means current, active. It's things that are going on. So chapter 7 is clearly talking about the second half of the tribulation. And then chapter 8 continues to talk about the seals. So they assume that everything is written in the book of Revelation chronologically. Therefore, if 6 is talking about the Great Tribulation and 7 is still talking about the seals, 7 and 8, then the whole thing must be in the first half. But you see, the book of Revelation is not written chronologically. In fact, if you look at your diagram, you will see that there are certain events, particularly here in the middle of the tribulation, chapter 7, chapter 12, chapter 13, chapter 17. These are all descriptions of things in the middle of the tribulation. But then later in the second half, we have chapter 8, chapter 11. So we can see from this, and we will go through as we hit those chapters and explain it, this is not a chronological accounting. And that's how some of these people get confused. But if you read Matthew chapter 24, and I encourage you to do that this week, particularly the latter half of it, where Jesus explains some of the signs of his coming and the end of the age. And in fact, some of those correspond so well with the seal judgments that I've included them in the text here. So that might help us understand the timing of these seal judgments. Revelation chapter 6, starting in verse 1. And incidentally, there is a lot of material here, and I don't want to speak for an hour and a half. So I'm going to skip over some things. You have the notes. You can go back and read them yourselves. Again, I encourage you to do that. And then if you have questions, you can ask me next week. Verse 1. Now I watched when the Lamb opened one of the 7 seals. That word lamb is Arneon, Little Lambkin. Remember, this is the little lambkin that looked like it had been slaughtered, and yet it was standing. I watched when the lambkin opened one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures say with a voice like thunder, "Come!" Now, some translations say, "Come, see," but the word "see" is not in some of the best texts. He's not speaking to John. He's speaking to the horseman. So he says, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a white horse, and its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him. And he came out conquering and to conquer. There are basically 3 schools of thought as to who the rider on the white horse is. There are some who believe that it's Jesus Christ himself. In Rome, it was very common when Rome defeated another country or another area that they would bring the captives, and the emperor would ride in front of the parade on a white horse with his captives behind him. So they said, this must be the conquering Christ. But it doesn't make sense. If he is the one opening the seals, then he can't be the one sitting on the horse. So it's probably not that. The second view is that this is the Antichrist, that since he is the one who is conquering and to conquer, that it must be a picture of him sitting on the horse. And those same people believe that the second horse is the false prophet, or the rider of the second horse. The problem is, in good biblical explanation, what's called exegesis, if one of these 4 horsemen is a person, then they all have to be specific people. You can't just have one of them be this and one of them be something else. And we know that the 4th rider is called death. That's not a person, it's an idea. So we have to consider that all of these horsemen are general ideas or concepts. So that brings us to the third explanation, that this is a false peace. He doesn't represent a specific person, and since the other writers are impersonal representations, war, famine, and death, then the rider of the first horse is also an impersonal representation. Now, he represents false peace, or a time of false peace. Notice he has a bow, but no arrows. He probably this may be a representation of how the Antichrist comes to power, but it's not the Antichrist himself. He probably comes to power threatening and going after other countries, but not defeating them, persuading them to join him instead. And we see that a crown was given to him. Now, we've noted before there are two different Greek words for crown. There's diadema, which refers to the ruling crown, and there's Stephanos, which refers to the victor's crown that's given away. This is a victor's crown. So apparently his ruling authority comes as a gift, either through an election or through others gathering together and choosing him. That's the first seal. Now that doesn't seem like a judgment, but it is part of God's judgment plan, as we will see. Verse 3, when he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, "Come!" And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth so that people should slay one another, and he was given a great sword. This rider is on a red horse. And it says he was permitted to take peace from the earth. Incidentally, let me read the Matthew section here. I forgot to do that on the first one. In the Matthew 26, verses 6 to 7, he says, "And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, for the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom." That's the wars that are going on here that's spoken of in Revelation. The rider was permitted to take peace from the earth. Now, it doesn't say the rider took peace from the earth. It said he was permitted to take peace from the earth. Well, who permitted him to do that? The little lambkin. So we see that it is God's intent to take away peace from the earth at this time. That's not a loving God, is it? We all tend to want to think of God as being love and kindness and goodness, but he is also a God of wrath, and he is pouring it out here, and that's why he has allowed peace to be taken from the earth. So this rider apparently symbolizes warfare. Verse 5. When he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come." Now notice, these are the living creatures that are around the throne, and there are 4 of them around the 4 sides of the throne, and each time it's a different living creature that says, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and his rider had a pair of scales in his hand, and I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the 4 living creatures. What's in the midst of the 4 living creatures? The throne of God. So this must be the voice of God that is saying this. "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine." In the parallel Matthew 24 passage says, "And there will be famines and earthquakes in various places." Now, as this seal is broken, the third rider comes, and he has a pair of scales in his hand, just like our Statue of Liberty has a pair of scales. In our case, the Statue of Liberty represents justice. In this case, it represents what is done when food is purchased in those days. And the Lord says a quart of wheat for a denarius and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius. So they would weigh out the amounts of food. Now, what's a denarius? I showed you a denarius coin previously. That's the amount of money that a common laborer would earn for 1 day of work. And the word quart here is actually the Greek word koinex, which means a measure. It's the amount of food that's required to sustain one person for 1 day. So it takes a whole day's wage to pay for one person's food. Well, what if you have a family? That's why the barley is 3 quarts or 3 measures for a denarius. It's inferior in its food quality, but it's cheaper, and at least those people can eat. And then it says, do not harm the oil and the wine. Well, there may be a couple of interpretations of this. One, it may be an indication that the rich people still have their luxuries because they can afford the food for the day and still have oil and wine. Or it may be an indication that wheat and barley are both annual crops. They have to be planted every year and cultivated every year, whereas olives and grapes come back year after year and just have to be harvested. I'm not sure which of those it is. Maybe it's both of them. The point is that this third horseman represents famine. There was peace, false peace, and then war, and now famine. And it's very common after wartime for there to be famine, particularly in the areas where the war was played out. Verse 7. When he opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, come. And I looked, and behold, a pale horse. Now the word pale is the Greek word chloros, which in most cases in the Bible is translated as green. It actually refers to the color of grass, not when it's lush and green, but when it's dying and fading. In secular writing, it's the same word is used to describe the color of honey or the color of desert sand. It's also used to describe the death pall color of a person just before they die. So this is death. That's probably the color that's being referred to here. And its writer's name was Death, and Hades followed him. Now actually the Greek word with is in there as well. So Hades followed with him. Death and Hades are working as a team here. And they were given authority over 1/4 of the earth to kill with sword, with famine, with pestilence, and by the wild beasts of the earth. First of all, if death and Hades are working together, let me ask you, where do saved people go when they die? Paradise, right, which, remember, is up against the third heaven, up against God's throne room. Where do the unsaved go when they die? To Hades. And here, death and Hades are working together. So it appears that all of those that die, the 1/4 of the population of the earth, are all unsaved during this first part of the tribulation. They are killed by sword, famine, pestilence, and wild beasts. Now, the word pestilence could be the same as a plague, or as we would say, a pandemic. There is another passage. Did I miss? Oh, okay. There's another passage in Ezekiel that talks about these 4 as well. He says, for thus says the Lord God, how much more when I send upon Jerusalem my 4 disastrous acts of judgment? Sword, famine, wild beasts, and pestilence, which again could be famine, could be a plague. Now, who are these wild beasts that might be killing people? If we think about the area around us here, there aren't very many wild beasts, possibly deer. Not very many of those. So who are these wild beasts? I wonder if it might be household pets who suddenly turn ferocious. A lot of people have dogs that are dangerous dogs if they get uncontrolled. Who knows? At least we know that, yeah, chickens could peck you to death, I guess. Anyway, they were given authority, these 4, over 1/4 of the earth. That means 1/4 of the population of the earth. Now currently, the population of the earth is just shy of 8 billion people. 1/4 of that would be 2 billion people. Not 2 million, 2 billion. That's 2,000 million. That's a lot of people. And that's just the beginning. Verse 9, when he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls who had been slain for the word of God, for the witness they had borne. How do you see underneath the altar? We've talked about this before too. They're standing in the throne room of God, right? And before the throne is a sea of glass clear as crystal, right? And what is directly beneath the throne room? Paradise. And these are those who have given their life for their faith. So, of course, they can see underneath the altar. Now, again, I've read some really good commentators talk about this, and in every case, they make it sound like, well, it's the blood that was poured out beside the altar that they're talking about, that they're not really underneath. Well, I think the text says that they were underneath the altar, and that's what I believe. They cried out with a loud voice, O sovereign Lord, holy and true. That word sovereign Lord is not the typical word for Lord, kurios. It's the word despotes, or despot, an all-powerful authority. How long before you will judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? The expression, those who dwell on the earth, that's the permanent earth dwellers. He said, how long before you will judge and avenge our blood on these permanent earth dwellers? Then they were each given a white robe and told to rest a little longer. What does that imply about what they have been doing? They've been resting. Those who are in paradise are at rest. The letters RIP, some people think means rest in peace. It really means rest in paradise. They were each given a white robe that represents what? Purity and sinlessness. Okay? And they were told to rest a little longer until the number of their fellow servants and their brothers should be complete, who were to be killed as they themselves had been. And we will find out later that those who refuse the mark of the beast will be killed. Then not only will they not be able to buy or sell, but if they're found, they'll be killed. So there are a lot more martyrs coming in this. And he said, rest a little longer. In fact, Revelation 10:6 says, and he swore by him who lives forever and ever, who created heaven and what is in it, the earth and what is in it, and the sea and what is in it, that there would be no more delay. That's Revelation chapter 10. So he tells them now to rest a little longer until the number is complete. But in chapter 10, he will say, okay, the delaying is over. Now it's going to happen. That takes us to the sixth seal judgment. When he opened the sixth seal, I looked, and behold, there was a great earthquake. This is a couple of Greek words that even you could translate. It's called seismos megos. Pretty obvious what that means, huh? A big shaking. And the sun became black as sackcloth. The full moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth as a fig tree sheds its winter fruit when shaken by a gale. The sky vanished like a scroll that is being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. I want to start off with the last part there. It says every mountain and island was removed from its place. That's an unfortunate translation because the word translated removed does not mean to be taken away. It means to be moved in its place. Okay? There is a time when islands will be removed and all mountains will disappear. At the very end of the tribulation, there is an even greater earthquake, and all the mountains will be flattened. The valleys will be raised up. In fact, Isaiah says, comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that her warfare is ended, and her iniquity is pardoned, and she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. A voice cries, in the wilderness prepare the way for the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill be made low. The uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. When Christ returns at Armageddon and comes and sets his feet on the mountain next to Israel, this is what this is referring to. The whole geology of the earth will be changed. And again, this is something that many, many commentators totally miss when they look at it. Now, when the earthquake happened, the sun became black as sackcloth. Now, this is a description that's given throughout the Old Testament for the day of the Lord. The sun's darkened, the moon turns blood red, and there's earthquakes. So we know that this is the beginning of the day of the Lord. The second half of the tribulation is the beginning of the day of the Lord. And this is just announcing that second half. Now, the stars fell to the earth. I read one commentator who's not a conservative who says, well, this is impossible because if a star fell to the earth, stars are much bigger than the earth and it would just vaporize the earth. So it can't mean stars fell to the earth. What they miss is the Greek word translated star is aster. And it refers to any heavenly body that we see in the sky. It could be a planet, it could be a star, it could be an asteroid, it could be a number of things. It could be a moon. Right. So it doesn't necessarily mean a star as we think of it. But what if it's not just an ordinary seismic earthquake? Recently, I read a book entitled The Comets of God by Dr. Jeffrey Goodman. And his theory is that this event and several of the events later on from the trumpet and bowl judgments were actually the result of interactions with the earth and comets. How many of you ever seen the Perseid meteor shower? You ever laid out on the grass and looked up and every minute or so you'd see another meteor coming through? That happens because the earth passes through an area where a comet had previously gone by. And it's the debris from the comet's tail that is actually appearing as meteors. Now, what's the difference between a meteor and a meteorite? A meteorite is a big meteor because it makes it all the way through the atmosphere and makes it to the earth. A meteor burns up. Seems counterintuitive, I know, but that's the way it is. So what if this event is not just a seismic earthquake, but one caused by a meteor impacting the earth? It would throw up so much dirt and debris into the environment, into the atmosphere, that the sun could possibly turn dark in places. The moon would, in fact, look blood red. You ever seen a total lunar eclipse? If you ever seen one, you notice that the moon actually looks red. And that's because it's in the shadow. Well, if this meteor came through, for a while, it would block out the light from the sun to the moon, and the moon would appear red. And also, the debris in the tail would appear like shooting stars. And there would be so many of them, possibly thousands or even millions, that it would appear like all the stars are falling from heaven. And as the comet passed by, it would block out the sun. And the sky would seem to just disappear from one end to the other and turn black. So I believe it's very possible that this event described here is a comet actually impacting the earth. Now, I am the first one to be critical of people who try to explain away all of God's miracles as natural phenomena. But this is one of those cases where I think it's quite possible. Verse 15. Then the kings of the earth and the great ones and the generals and the rich and the powerful and everyone slave and free hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks and the mountains. Now there were 7 groups of people described there. Kings, great ones, general, rich, powerful, And then the final two, everyone's slave and free. And remember, 7 in the Bible is the number of completeness. So that means all of the people, whether they're powerful or not. They hid themselves in caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling on the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand? In fear, all of these permanent earth dwellers are now trying to hide from God, and they think that if they're dead, that they will be able to hide from God. What a surprise awaits them. Because, in fact, in death, they will experience God's wrath to a greater degree than when they're alive. And it says in the end here, and who can stand? I like what Romans 14 says, for it is written, as I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God. None will be able to stand in the presence of Almighty God. Now, one more thing I want to point out. As John is describing these events on the earth, he is actually in God's throne room, up in heaven. He's there in spirit, but he is there. And who else is there? The church. We are going to be in God's throne room while all this is going on, and it appears, since John can see what's happening, that we will be able to observe the tribulation and all that's happening there. And we will be observing it from a safe, pardon the pun, a safe haven. Well, so what? Let's stop for a minute and put ourselves in the shoes of the permanent earth dwellers. At this point in time, they've seen a world ruler come to power without having to defeat or even attack other countries. But then war does break out, and it quickly becomes a world war. Perhaps the peaceful countries are tired of seeing a deceptive tyrant controlling one country after another, and they band together to stop the thug before he takes control of the whole world. Oops, too late. The effect of this world war is that it causes a worldwide food shortage. And the formerly rich industrial countries are now food-poor countries. However, the elites of the world, the Hollywood stars, and the rich still have everything that they want. Well, so far, this doesn't sound so out of the ordinary. Not a lot different than the last 75 to 100 years of history on the earth. But I wonder if these permanent earth dwellers even realize that there are no more Christians around. Remember what Paul told the Thessalonians about this world ruler? Listen carefully. He says, the coming of the lawless one is by the activity of Satan with all power and false signs and wonders, and with all wicked deception for those who are perishing, because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. Therefore, God sends them a strong delusion, so that they may believe what is false, in order that all may be condemned who did not believe the truth but had pleasure in unrighteousness. I think what this is telling us is that this future world ruler, who is empowered by Satan, will be able to convince everybody that the disappearance of the Christians, that's no big thing. In fact, it's good. We're a better world now because of it. Don't worry about them. They really didn't know what they were doing. Well, perhaps the lawless one had already given out the explanation, and Paul tells us that the earth dwellers will believe that lie. No matter what they believe, they will soon become very aware that people are dying in massive numbers all over the world. 1 out of every 4 people has died. Some because of the war, some because of the famine, some because of a pandemic and they didn't get vaccinated in time, and some because all the tame animals now seem to be attacking everybody. Was that a political statement? I'm sorry. Then the discovery of a comet, which had not been seen because of its proximity to the sun, and it crashes into the earth, causing a massive earthquake. The air is so filled with debris from the impact that the sun can barely be seen in some places, and the moon appears blood red in others. All of this is accompanied by a meteor shower, the likes of which has never before been seen. It appears like all the stars are falling from the sky. Now, at this point, perhaps some former unsaved church member will recall what was once preached to them about the period called the tribulation. For a short while, there may even be a massive interest in reading the Bible, especially the book of Revelation. But one by one, they give up because it's so impossible to understand all this cryptic message. Nonetheless, everyone seems to become aware that God is behind all the death and destruction, and there's nothing they can do about it. This is just the beginning. These are just the beginning of birth pangs, as Christ said. We're still at the end of the first half of the tribulation. The second half is coming, and it will be horrible compared to what's just happened. Now, I know most of you, if not all of you, are good, God-fearing Christians. I have no doubt that we will all go together in the rapture. But what about our family members and friends? I know lots of you have family members that you grieve over. I have an older brother and an older sister, neither one of which is saved. And I grieve over that. We've all tried witnessing to our family, but they just see us as a bunch of religious fanatics. My sister once said to me, "I am so glad you found religion." What can we do? We can pray for them. And prayer is not a last resort thing we do. It should be a first resort thing that we do. So as we close here, I want to pray. And I want to invite you to pray. If you have a family member or a good friend who is unsaved, I want you to pray for them. And